Nutra Longevity Lab series, where science meets strategy for a longer and healthier life. I'm Renee Fitton, a host and longevity dietitian, and also the director of education at Nutra. Every episode, we explore the latest research, expert insights, and practical tools to help you harness the power of fasting, nutrition, and longevity science. Whether you're a wellness enthusiast or just starting your journey, we're here to empower you with knowledge that supports vibrant, lasting health. And today we have an incredible guest, a leader in fasting and longevity. And so we are very excited to have Dr. Jason Fung joining us today. As I mentioned, based out of Toronto, Canada, a renowned nephrologist, New York Times best-selling author, not just one book, but many, including The Obesity Code, The Complete Guide to Fasting, The Diabetes Code, and The Cancer Code. They've all challenged conventional thinking about these diseases and introduce dietary strategies to manage them. He is the co-founder of the Fasting Method, which provides education, tools, and community needed to successfully implement intermittent fasting. So you can imagine that in covering the topic of fasting, we could not have asked a better co-host here today. So hello, Dr. Fung, and thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I'm sure that people are I can already see questions funneling in. So let's get to some basic questions just to get everybody looped in on what we're going to be talking about today. And maybe first, just starting with your story on how you first came to explore fasting as a therapeutic tool and how that journey shaped your approach to treating metabolic conditions.
Yeah, so I'm a nephrologist, which means I'm a kidney specialist, and I actually wasn't that interested in diet for a long time, actually. So I went through medical school, I did my nephrology fellowship. So it's quite an extended training period as a physician. It's 4 years of medical school, then I did 3 more years at the University of Toronto in internal medicine. Then I did 2 years in Los Angeles at UCLA for nephrology. And then I became a kidney specialist and I came back to Toronto to practice. And for most of it, I was just sort of just dealing with kidney disease. But it turns out that the most common cause of kidney disease, really by far, is type 2 diabetes. And it's closely linked to obesity, and it's been going up and up and up, as you all know. So my practice became much more focused on diabetes because it was just becoming so much more prevalent and it was causing kidney disease. So those were a lot of my patients. So somewhere around 2012, say, I started to become very interested in the topic of weight loss because it occurred to me that really the way we were treating type 2 diabetes was totally incorrect. We were giving lots of medications, but we weren't actually looking at the underlying problem. And at the time, of course, type 2 diabetes was considered a chronic and progressive disease, which means that once you had it for life. Everybody said it. The American Diabetes Association had it on their website, said basically, once you have it for life. It's chronic and progressive. Take your meds. And it was funny because actually it wasn't that funny. It was sort of odd because even though they said it, every doctor said it, every lecture you went to about type 2 diabetes said it, but it was a huge lie. It was just a lie because it was a reversible disease. Everybody knew it. So doctors knew it, patients knew it. And the thing was that, and here was the big disconnect, that if you lost weight, then your diabetes would often get better or go away, which means that it was reversible. However, the dietary advice at the time, which is all of calorie, count your calories, count your calories, count your calories, was so spectacularly unsuccessful at getting people to lose weight that doctors basically gave up on that sort of advice. They treated it as a foregone conclusion. And the thing is that if you treat type 2 diabetes, which is a largely dietary disease, with just a bunch of drugs, you will never make it better. So because doctors were giving drugs for a dietary disease and it wasn't getting better, they said, well, they had a choice at that point. Either they had to acknowledge that they were not that smart and, treating a dietary disease with drugs, or they could just say, the diseases incurable. And then they could like absolve themselves. Like rather than take the difficult task of saying, what is the underlying problem, which is, of course, weight gain. So therefore, you must lose weight to reverse the diabetes. They took the sort of mentally easy way out and said, oh, it's not that I'm not doing a good job. I am doing a good job. This is a bad disease, which is intellectually very dishonest and really got me a little bit mad about the whole thing because it's like, why are you lying to people, right? Like, yes, I get it. You're lying to people because you're lying to yourself. Doctors were lying to themselves. All the doctors, all the professional, societies, American Diabetes Association, they said it was a chronic progressive disease because they couldn't cure it with their stupid drugs. They didn't understand that it had completely gone the wrong way because it was a dietary problem. But at the same time that they were saying that, every patient knew this. Patients knew, hey, I have, my doctor said I had diabetes, then I lost 50 pounds. It went away. I went off all my medications. You heard this story all the time. So clearly they're focused on the wrong thing. So I became very interested not in drugs, which is honestly what consumes like 95% of a doctor's mind is drugs and surgery. I became very, very interested in diet and weight loss because that was what was needed to get my patients better. And as I dug into the evidence for it, it occurred to me that again, it was just there just wasn't a lot of smart people thinking in this field. It was all about, you know, calories, calories, calories. It's like, okay, but haven't you been talking about calories for the last 50 years to sort of this stunning failure? Like it was, an approach, count your calories, cut your calories, right? Everybody's done it. It fails in everybody, right? It was basically had a perfect record, unblemished by success. So the whole thing is that there has to be a better strategy to it. And, one of the strategies that I was thinking about was intermittent fasting, which of course everybody agreed at the time, this 2014, 2015, was a really, really bad idea, right? So dietitians hated me because they're like, oh, you have to eat 10 times a day. And I'm thinking, why? Why does the human body need to eat 10 times a day? It doesn't make any sense because the whole thing is that your body can store calories in the form of body fat, in the form of sugar. So if you don't eat, your body has the capability to pull those calories back out. Like, why do you think your body is storing fat? It's not for looks. It's for you to use as a source of energy, source of calories. So why you keep stuffing your face with calories if you're trying to lose weight? Like it doesn't make any sense. And yet everybody was saying you have to eat 10 times a day. Breakfast is the more important meal of the day. Gotta eat, gotta eat, gotta eat to lose weight. I'm thinking, how's that gonna work? Like, how do you lose weight while you're eating all the time? You actually can't. And that was the whole problem. So that's where I started thinking about fasting and its applicability, but mostly the physiology of what's happening in your body, and then realizing that one, I actually was telling people to fast all the time, right? So you had to fast if you're pre-op, like before surgery. You had to fast if you're post-op. You had to fast if you're being treated for lots of different diseases. You had to fast if you did an ultrasound, if you did a colonoscopy, and if you wanted to do blood work, fasting blood work, you needed to fast. So the whole thing was that here I'm telling people you have to fast for this, you have to fast for this, you have to fast for this. But for actual weight loss as a treatment, oh no, it's the worst thing you could possibly do. Like, how does that even make sense? I've been telling people to fast for a decade, nothing bad happened. Like, yeah, sure, they might have been hungry and not happy about it, but nothing bad happened. But if you do it for actual therapy, then all of a sudden it's the worst thing you could really do, right? That doesn't make any sense. So the whole thing is, as I started to go into it, it really, I really started to talk about the science of it, why you can do it, and why really there was actually this huge number of benefits that nobody had even talked about. So, and I was writing about it and so on. And really one of the only other, like, there's very few people at the time. But Dr. Longo was probably one of the few people that was there before me talking about fasting, because I think he had been in that space for a few years before that. Dr. Matson also was there, but really, they were more researchers, whereas I am more clinical. I'm more interested in treating people, giving them options. So it was much more about writing and telling people about it so that they could know about it and so on. So anyway, that was how I came to it, and then then I wrote a book about it and so on.
Well, it is so incredible that despite, a decade of education kind of pointing you in a different direction that was so medication forward, that you were able to kind of peek past the curtain and say, okay, something is wrong here, and really start moving the needle in the other direction. I'm just curious, how you feel like we might be able to continue to move other physicians in this direction and help them see the light. Is there anything that you see as a way to change that?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of movement. So at um if you look at so 2016 is when I published the obesity code, and also the complete guide to fasting. And the thing is that it was sort of widely considered just the height of stupidity, right? Fasting was so bad for you, right? Which is strange, because if you go sort of before that whole thing, people thought fasting was actually great for you, right? And that goes for thousands of years, right? From really
Historically,
biblical
absolutely.
times to the 1970s. Fasting was actually this great thing that you're supposed to do. It's so good for you, not fun, but good for you, right? You did it once a year during Lent or during Ramadan or during Yom Kippur because it was good for you, right? So it's strange because it went from really good for you to really bad for you. And then when I published it, so now, of course, the funny part about it, of course, was that a lot of physicians immediately saw, because I was writing about physiology, mostly what happens in the human body. A lot of physicians actually saw the logic of what I was talking about right away. So it did get traction very quickly. And, by 2018, 2019, it had been one of the most popular topics, because it was relatively new. And people really talked about it. By 2020, of course, everybody just started thinking about COVID. But from 2016 to 2020, it was very, very topical. So it gained a lot of acceptance. You see that there's a lot of books about fasting now. The doctors, of course, take a while to, because if you've been practicing for 20 years thinking that you got to eat 10 times a day, it's really hard to change your mind, right? Data is slowly coming out now, and science is the way to reach them. But there hadn't been any science for ages. The first few studies on fasting, they were like, really badly done, I have to say. They did this thing where they'd say, okay, fast for one day and then eat double your calories the next day. I'm like, why the hell would you do that? Right. And I'm thinking, you're such an idiot, because it's like, clinically, right? And the whole thing comes down to, you got to treat the patient in front of you. Like, you would never do that to a patient. If you're trying to get them to lose weight, reverse their diabetes, you're not going to say, okay, today you don't eat, but tomorrow you eat double. So why would you do a study like that? And it's because they weren't clinicians. They didn't know what they're doing, right? And they didn't ask. They just went and did it because it worked on rats. That's what they said, right? It's like, holy crap. So anyway, there's a couple of studies early on in the 2020s that got published, which were really bad. And, you know, it sort of put everybody back. But now you're starting to see a lot of data coming out with fasting, and super beneficial now that people are doing it, in a clinically correct way. Like, it's not like, it's like, with Al Nutri, you don't say fast for 5 days and for 5 days eat double. Like, what? How are you going to lose weight like that? How are you? You're crazy if you do that. But anyway, that was the equivalent of what they're doing. This is just insane. So anyway,
Right.
the data is coming out, and I think that's what's important. It's becoming more sort of topical from a public standpoint, which is pushing a lot of physicians in that way to get towards fasting. And hopefully, people can continue that, right? And the thing is that with fasting is that you can do it yourself. You don't need a doctor's permission. Obviously, if you're on medications, you have to adjust it and stuff. So you do have to be careful, but there's a lot more acceptance now, compared to when I started. And again, it's because you just have to tell people about what the possibilities are, right? It had never been in the realm of possibilities. And I remember what was fascinating was that I remember watching an episode of The Biggest Loser in like 2015 or something like that. And so there's this one guy, he's exercising and stuff, and he had lost a lot of weight. They had all lost a lot of weight on that show, right? They don't keep it off, but they were losing weight. And it was quite funny because he was talking about losing the weight, and somebody was like, "Oh, you're cheating because you didn't eat yesterday." And and the guy was like, "Well, I wasn't hungry." I'm like, "Well, that's perfect. Like if you're not hungry and you have a lot of body fat with a lot of calories, why would you want to put more calories into your body? Because your body is carrying a lot of calories sitting in body fat." But it was so prevalent at the time that you must always eat. And it's like, okay, he's not cheating. He's doing the most logical thing, right? It was just a, it was just a funny thing. Now, of course, there's more acceptance. So if you want to fast, then go fast, right? And it was odd too, because people when I started said, oh, well, people who fast, what if they do too much fasting? And I'm like, God, you're stupid. I was like, I've been doing it with hundreds and hundreds of patients. My problem is not that they do too much, right? Because I'm doing it in older people who are trying to lose weight because they're 50 pounds overweight. They're trying to get rid of their diabetes, right? I'm not treating like an 18-year-old girl who weighs 94 pounds and wants to weigh 88, right? That's the absolute wrong place to do fasting. Whereas your 300-pound man who has type 2 diabetes and is on 100 units of insulin, that's the right place, right? So you got to be clinical. And it's like, oh man, it's like people think that, they try to like do these gotcha things. And it's like, oh God, like, of course, it's a tool like anything else. You got to use it in the right setting, right? So
Right.
and again, in The Biggest Loser, that was the right setting. He was terribly overweight. It was causing knee problems and all that. So fasting for a day, and it was only a day, it was like amazing. Like it was great for him. He felt good.
Absolutely. The power of personalized medicine and the power of science. So it sounds like as you anticipate that as research continues to come on board and people really start seeing the evidence that the light will be shone upon us all and we'll be able to really get on board. But you brought up a couple of times this concept of overweight and the association of with type 2 diabetes. And we got a really great question actually from Nancy Banson, who says approximately 20% of individuals with type 2 diabetes patients are not overweight. How are you accounting for those in your comments? And is that still reversible with fasting? So can you still, if you have a patient with type 2 diabetes that is not necessarily overweight, is there still an opportunity there, which ties beautifully into one of my next questions, which was how fasting goes beyond weight loss and maybe taps into some of these more metabolic health concepts like insulin sensitivity and inflammation and some of the other pieces that we're tapping into.
Yeah, and it is a very good question actually, because it's not really the body fat, it's the ectopic body fat. So fat that you carry under the skin. So fat in your fat cells under the skin where you're supposed to keep it is fine, right? That's where it's supposed to go. That's what it's supposed to do. Fat cells are supposed to store fat. So you have fat under the skin and so on. And if you lose a lot of that fat, you actually look terrible because you look gaunt and so on. So that's what they talk about sometimes with Ozempic face and stuff, right? So you lose so much weight that you actually look terrible. But so fat in fat cells, and it's under the skin, is actually fine. There's no metabolic consequences to it. This is where it's supposed to go. The problem is when you have fat in your liver. So your liver is not supposed to have fat. So that's a real problem, and it's linked to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So you don't necessarily have to be overweight, because remember that when you weigh yourself, it's a very rough scale. So we do the body mass index, but it's a very rough because it doesn't distinguish between, for example, muscle and fat, and it doesn't distinguish between visceral fat and subcutaneous fat. But there's huge important differences between muscle and fat, obviously, but also between visceral fat and other fat. So if you look at a few years ago, I was looking at a study in China, actually, and also India, they had the same thing. And the average body mass index of a Chinese person with type 2 diabetes was like 24.2, which is actually normal weight. And that's the average. And it's all type 2 diabetes. The thing was that they're carrying a lot of visceral fat, not a lot of subcutaneous fat, and therefore their body mass index was fine. Now, you do have to distinguish between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes because there are underweight people or normal weight people who don't actually have type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is a totally different disease, and type 1 diabetes is a lower, you have too little insulin. Type 2 diabetes, you have too much insulin. So therefore, if you're going to use a treatment like fasting, so remember, insulin is a nutrient sensor. When you eat particularly carbohydrates, insulin goes up. So if you have too much insulin, like type 2 diabetes, then obviously fasting is good because you're going to lower insulin. So fasting lowers insulin. Low carb diets also and ketogenic diets also lower insulin. So if your disease is that you have too much insulin, well, fasting is great because you're going to lower insulin. If your disease is that you have too little insulin, well, fasting is not going to do anything for you because it's going to lower insulin, but your insulin's already low, and that wasn't your problem, right? So you do have to distinguish between the two types of disease because actually they're opposite. So you can't treat both. You can treat it with low carbohydrate diets, for example, because you're not trying to lose weight. At the same time, your body doesn't have to produce as much insulin, so there is a way to treat it. But from a reversibility standpoint, it's not necessarily the total body weight that's really important. So Indians and Chinese people or Asians, East Asians and South Asians actually tend to have type 2 diabetes at a much, much lower body mass index than an American or Canadian or North American. So 24.2 was for the Asians, and I think it was like 27 or 29 for Americans. So they got diabetes at a much, much lower body mass index or body weight.
Interesting. And I love that you brought up the difference between type 2 and type 1, and the concept of insulin as it relates to both. Now, I did want to bring up a really interesting study that was done with fasting mimicking, specifically in type 1 diabetes models. And I do want to clarify it's a model, therefore it was done in mice, so it is not a human trial. But it showed that with prolonged fasts, these longer 5-day fasting mimicking type protocols, there was actually the regeneration of the beta cells. And so because fasting also, it taps into more than just reduced calories and even more than just improvement in insulin sensitivity, it also has the potential to have that cellular rejuvenation capability, which also opens up this world of so many other benefits that it can have. Now, again, we certainly are not making any claims around type 1 diabetes, at least not yet, because the research is still quite new. But the fact that those are the capabilities of fasting and fasting mimicking, because it taps at such a root approach as opposed to just, working at the calorie level or what have you, there's so much opportunity there. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for type 1 diabetes, it's an autoimmune disease, which means that your immune system is attacking itself, attacking your pancreatic beta cells. And what's super, super interesting about some of the data that Alnitra actually is doing is that here's that you can even sort of modulate or reset the immune system with some of these longer fasts, like 5 to 7 days, which is actually so interesting and makes a lot of sense because if you think about it, what happens during fasting is that you're reducing your so-called nutrient sensors. So nutrient sensors are insulin and mTOR. And when you eat carbs, insulin goes up. When you eat protein, mTOR goes up. and they tell your body that, hey, nutrients are coming in, grow. Okay. When the opposite happens, when you fast and you don't eat, your body gets the nutrient sensors go down and it tells your body, hey, no nutrients are coming in. You need to go into this sort of restorative, sort of latent regenerative mode. And what your body does, especially for these longer fasts, is to basically get rid of any cells that are unnecessary, right? And that makes sense. It's totally logical, right? So if your body has an overactive immune system, well, potentially your body is going to ramp it down, which is perfect for something like type 1 diabetes, because if you reduce the autoimmune attack on those pancreatic beta cells, potentially you're going to allow them to regenerate. I think there's another study on they did with autoimmunity, but in clinical practice, we actually hear tons of people who say their thyroid got better. And it's like, whoa, thyroid, I didn't expect that. You know, I'm expecting weight loss, diabetes, right? Sugars. But the thing was that a lot of thyroid disease is also autoimmune mediated. So people would come in, and this was completely unexpected. It's because, you know, we've treated at the fasting method like thousands of people, right? So every so often, somebody comes in and they go, oh yeah, my thyroid, it's all better, it's completely better. I'm like, whoa, we didn't expect that, but we'll take it, right? And it's probably due to the autoimmunity, and there's other, you know, benefits too. The lower insulin levels affects a disease called polycystic ovary disease, polycystic ovary syndrome, for example. And then we've had a lot of people who are like, oh, they're able to get pregnant. It's like, okay, that's amazing, because again, it's about lowering that insulin levels and allowing your body to sort of regenerate, which is sort of, it goes beyond just the calories, weight loss, diabetes, which is the most obvious effect, but also, and very important, but there might be other really, really important benefits that you see with the fasting. I think we're only, you know, scratching the surface here, because honestly, you know, because there is no research in it for so long. I mean, L-Nutra honestly is probably one of the places that's doing the most research on it, especially at a basic science level, because a lot of these other ones are just weight loss focus, right? Which is important, but you know, not doesn't generate new hypotheses. But I mean, they have studies, and you know, other than the autoimmunity, you know, cancer and stuff. It's like, whoa, that's fascinating. Like that could really be a very useful tool for people, right? So interesting. You know, diabetes, there was one on chronic kidney disease, so not diabetic kidney disease, but other forms of kidney disease. And it's like, I totally didn't expect that. But again, it might be due to this sort of regenerative, restorative process, and maybe you get a lot less fibrosis, because again, you're not getting that insulin, which, remember, all the nutrient sensors are also growth factors. So when your nutrients come in, your body says, make hay while the sun is shining, you got to grow. So all these growth factors are good, except they do cause more scarring and fibrosis. So reducing them can actually have some benefits. So that was a really interesting study they did just this year, I think. So I did a YouTube video about the fasting and CKD. Very, very interesting to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that was one of the L-Nutra studies as well. And there's so much research, as you mentioned, especially coming out recently. We just had a new interesting study on hyposmia, where there is regeneration of sense of smell and taste that is also being activated in patients with type 2 diabetes. But let's take a step back to type 2 diabetes, especially because as many listeners are probably now familiar, L-Nutra has since released the L-Nutra Health programs, which offer the ability to leverage fasting mimicking for individuals with type 2 diabetes and metabolic health considerations. And they also add in labs and medication management where necessary, and of course, dietitian and physician oversight. So, really turning this into a whole program for patients with type 2 diabetes. So, Dr. Fung, as somebody who is certainly an advocate for leveraging fasting in this population. Tell me a little bit about how you see programs like L-Nutra Health programs and fasting mimicking diet fitting into patient care.
I think it's really, really important because if you think about the traditional care of a patient with type 2 diabetes, it's really bad. Because what happens is that, say you have, you go in to see your doctor, you have type 2, they say, oh, now you have type 2 diabetes, right? You've got 5 minutes for that clinic visit, right? Because, your family doctor, like honestly, they have different pay scales, but in Ontario, you might get like $14 for that visit, right? So it's a 5 minute visit, right? Otherwise, that poor family doctor can't even pay his secretary, right? If you spend an hour, you got $14 for it. That's less than minimum wage, right? So the problem is you got your 5 minutes with the doctor, but now you've got this really important disease, and the accepted treatment for this disease is diet and lifestyle. That is, every single textbook in the world will tell you that for type 2 diabetes, your first treatment, your second treatment, and your third treatment is diet and lifestyle. But does anybody talk to you about it? No. Does anybody tell you about it? No. Does anybody tell you what your proper diet should be? No. Does anybody tell you how to do the fasting? No. You get a prescription for, whatever drug they prefer to use, right? And that's the way it's treated all over the world. And it's unfortunate because it's completely wrong. It's acknowledged to be completely wrong, but it is the way it is for 99.9% of the population. That's what you're getting because of the realities of our medical care system. And it's odd because, I have more people who have come to me saying that, they got off their medications by watching a YouTube video, like one of my YouTube videos, right? And it's like, okay, why did a YouTube video cure this person, but their doctor couldn't, right? It's sad. It's a sad state of affairs, right? Your doctor won't tell you what you need to know because they don't have time. And they could refer you to a dietitian potentially, but a lot of those are not covered. You might have to pay for it yourself. And honestly, a lot of the information around, diabetics and their diets for many years was based on a low-fat diet, which was not particularly good for type 2 diabetes. In fact, it was very bad for type 2 diabetes. So they'd say, eat low fat, eat lots of carbs. And the problem is that carbs are going to raise your blood glucose. Why? Because carbohydrates are glucose. If you eat a starchy food like bread or rice or potatoes, you have to understand that that starch, bread or rice or potatoes, is actually a molecule called amylopectin or amylose, which is a long chain of glucose. When you eat that bread or rice or potatoes, your body chops it up into glucose, and your blood glucose, i.e., your blood sugar, goes up. So, in other words, you eat carbs, you're eating glucose, your blood glucose goes up. Or you're eating carbs, you're eating sugar, your blood sugar goes up. But if you eat an egg, there's no carbs, so therefore you're not eating glucose and your blood glucose doesn't go up. So therefore, you have some foods that raise your blood sugars and some foods that don't raise your blood sugars. And we were telling people to eat lots of the food that raises their blood sugars, even though their blood sugars were too high. Complete insanity. But that was the standard. Things are changing a little bit. And the other thing they told type 2 diabetics is never ever fast. It's like, okay, but think about it for a second. What happens when you fast? Well, your body has all this extra sugar. That's why you got told you're a type 2 diabetic, right? Well, that's a source of energy. If you don't eat, if you fast, what's going to happen? Your body's going to start burning all that sugar. Hey, isn't that like a really, really good thing, right? Your body has too much sugar, you don't eat, and you let your body burn off that sugar that's giving you the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. And people are like, oh, well, you need energy. It's like, what are you talking about? Your body has too much energy, not too little energy, it has too much energy. So therefore, let your body burn off that sugar. So therefore, these programs are so important to really changing the face of medicine. And unfortunately, you can't roll it out everywhere. But the idea is that not only is the drugs an important component of management of type 2 diabetes, and there are lots of people who are going to need drugs. I prescribe drugs every single day, but you have to remember that the bulk of type 2 diabetic care should be dietary and lifestyle. And I'm actually starting a clinic. So in Canada, in Toronto, actually, I'm starting this clinic called the Diabetes Code Clinic, that is trying to focus again on people on diet. So, we're trying to do these sessions, for example, so group sessions focus on diet, right? 6 sessions once a month, and then we continue to talk to them about diet. Like, because we're doing a group session, it's like an hour rather than your 5 minutes, right? But then you can pool it, and then if everybody's there together, then you can actually pay your doctor a reasonable amount to talk about diet. So hopefully I'm getting that done. But again, it's the same idea. So I agree with you completely. So you have to have the doctor there to adjust your medications, to prescribe your medications, but you need to focus on the diet. And they're two completely different things, right? One is diet, one is the drugs that you need to take. And they're both important, but we've so ignored the other one. So that's why these sort of programs, I think, are really, really important. If you don't, you're getting like 50% or less of the care that you really should be getting.
Absolutely. And I mean, the numbers are there to support it. Just recently, just this last past year, the study that came out on patients with type 2 diabetes dropping their A1C by 1.4% while coming off of medication, 67% of patients reducing their medication with fasting mimicking protocols, where they're doing these protocols for 5 days a month, right? And then the remaining 25 days getting dietitian support. So 2 visits with a dietitian a month is what's included in that protocol. I mean, it really is comprehensive, and it's working at the nutritional level above anything else, aiming, in fact, not even, of course, to manage medications, but ideally even to reduce or ideally remove medication entirely, which is the incredible science behind fasting and fasting mimicking. And actually, thank you, Kate Wolf, for your question, who says, what is fasting mimicking? Which is a very fair question because we barely touched on that. So, Dr. Fung, can you just share a little bit really quickly what fasting mimicking is?
Yeah, so fasting is really any time you don't eat. Now, it can be different ways, right? So you can do it 16 hours, you can do it 24 hours, you could do it 3 days, you could do it 5 days, right? So if you don't eat for 5 days, that's fasting for 5 days. Um, it's not the easiest thing to do, but you know what the idea was is that you can get most of the benefits of fasting without actually fasting. So that's where the fasting mimicking diet comes in, because it's not a fast, it's a mimicking a fast. And what Dr. Longo and Dr. Antoon and others did was try to develop a diet, and it is quite low in calories, obviously, because you're trying to mimic it, but it's not zero. So the whole point is that you're trying to lower those nutrient sensors, so it's relatively low in protein, and it's plant-based and gluten-free. And they developed this diet. So for 5 days a month, what you would do is follow a very specific sort of protocol. You get a box, it's got 5 boxes, and on day one, they give you a full whole schedule of, there's a couple of packets of soup, there's some tea, there's some drink, and on certain days you might have a little bit of olives or a little bit of crackers. But the point is that it's designed to keep your insulin levels low and your mTOR levels low. Therefore, you're getting a lot of the benefits of the fasting without real fasting, without actually fasting. So therefore, if you can make it like 70% easier, but still get most of your benefits, hey, that's a huge, huge plus, right? So, and I did the fasting mimicking diet. It's actually very easy. It actually takes a lot of the guesswork out of what you're trying to do. I mean, the the whole thing makes a lot of sense, because now what you've got, and I realized this after, so I realized this afterwards, that it's actually quite powerful, because when I was dealing with a lot of people who are fasting, it takes a lot of time to say, here's what you should do. And then you tell them, and then they go home and still do whatever they feel like. So it's difficult because it's not structured as opposed to just getting a very, here's day one. You've got the soups in there, you've got your crackers in there, you've got your olives in there, and this is all you eat. So instructions are super clear. There's no ambiguity whatsoever in what you're trying to do. Whereas the difference when I was telling people, do this, half of them would do it. And then when you check, they probably didn't do it right. And the other half didn't do it at all. I'm like, oh, okay. So from a compliance standpoint, it's actually very smart to have something available. And I'm not saying that everybody has to do it, but it's an option. And it's actually a very smart option for people who really want to have that 100% sort of, this is what you do, right? So and a lot of the people I treat are older, so they're like, oh, I don't remember what Dr. Fung said. Am I supposed to do this or am I supposed to do this, right? I don't know. Like, so they have the best intentions, but they just don't remember or they just didn't understand, and therefore they did it all wrong, and they're not getting the benefits, right? So that's what the fasting mimicking diet is, and so I think it's actually a very smart solution.
Absolutely. And it certainly takes out a lot of the guesswork. It adds a level of safety and security. And with programs like L Nutra Health, where you get the physician and dietitian oversight, you really, truly all of the guesswork is kind of taken out of there. And actually, I saw a note here in our Q&A from Helen Kay, who shared that she had been told essentially what you were sharing, Dr. Fung. And then finally somebody introduced her to Prolon, and she tried Prolon, and then she actually ended up transitioning to the L Nutra Health programs. And she said that that's actually where she finally saw the change, because she said that's where she saw the support, instead of with even fasting mimicking through Prolon alone, which I think is just such an interesting concept. And I think it goes back to this point of how important physician support, dietitian support, and the guidance that you as a clinician and our clinicians provide.
Absolutely. And the whole point is that if it's difficult, then there are ways to make it easier, right? And that's the idea. Because one of the things, of course, is that when you're fasting, it's people get hungry, right? And you're going against what you're used to doing. So therefore, what can you do about it? And that's where talking to somebody who's done it before can really help. I mean, it's a really an interesting thing. It's sort of like the way people used to do it, which was like if you're fasting, whether it was Lent or Ramadan or Yom Kippur, it was everybody doing it. So therefore, you've got that whole group of people that's going to support what you're doing and help you with what you're doing, as opposed to you trying to do it by yourself, right? It's no different than, if you run by yourself versus joining a running club. It's actually a lot easier to stick with it when you're in a running club because everybody else is there and you've got your friends there, right? And so the whole idea is that you've got that support because everybody thinks it's about willpower, but it's not. It's about your systems. If your system includes the support of a group, it's a lot more powerful than you trying to bare knuckle it yourself.
Absolutely. And that's also why at Prolon, we have our group fast with L Nutra Health. There's group sessions and, of course, the support. But I'd like to kind of dovetail right off of that and talk a little bit more about some of the strategies that you recommend to your patients who are looking to make fasting easier or more approachable to their daily lives.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different strategies. I mean, one of the things is that you can choose whatever time period suits you best. I mean, fasting is just about um, not eating. So if you're doing a 5-day fast, it can be a little bit weird from a social standpoint because you're not eating. If you have lunch with somebody or if you have dinner with somebody, it's like, oh, well, if you're not eating, then what are you doing, right? So that's where having a bit of guidance can help. Having people support you can help. There's dealing with the hunger, and there's different things like you can, take some tea, you can take some, and they have a lot of herbal teas with the Prolon, for example, and they have a fasting drink that you're supposed to take with it. There's a lot of things you can do from a mindset standpoint, which I think is fascinating. I'll share with you that I was reading this book called The Expectation Effect, which is actually quite an interesting book. And it's talking about mindsets and how mindsets actually play a huge role in how successful you are in something. And I realized that I had been doing something without knowing quite what it was. But one of the things that you can do, and this is a technique from cognitive behavioral therapy, is creating a mantra. So when you're hungry, for example, you want to reframe that hunger as a good thing. So, because hunger is not usually that pleasant, right? So you want to reframe that as a good thing. So what I did, I'm actually in the middle of a 4-day fast, but what I did was whenever I get hungry, I say to myself, I grab my belly and I go, burn, baby, burn. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I'm hungry. But the hunger is a good thing because it's allowing me to burn my fat, which is what it's doing, of course, right? You're pulling the energy because I know, I'm 2 days into it now, but I know that my glycogen stores are pulled out. So therefore, I'm actually burning fat or triglycerides as a source of energy. So what I've done is I've reframed that hunger into a good thing and used the mantra to really remind myself that this is a positive thing. And I know that it's also going to pass, because that's the other thing. It's you have to know that the hunger, if you simply ignore it, will actually just pass. It's like a wave. So therefore, I know it's going to pass. So I just need something to temporize me through. So I usually get something to drink, and I repeat to myself, burn, baby, burn. And then that's it. And then I go about my activity. And it actually made a huge difference. Like, so, especially for these longer fasts where the hunger can be more of an issue. The other thing, of course, is with the L-Nutra, with the science. So in the past, I just do white, like water only or teas, that kind of thing, right? But now I see that because of the science, there's a lot of data to show that even if you take a little bit of calories, you're not going to completely ruin it, right? It's not like you eat 2 olives on your on day 4 of a 5-day fast. Oh, man, you're all done now, right? No, you take a little bit of food, you're gonna temporarily increase your nutrient sensors, but by a tiny amount, and then you're gonna go right back into all of the fasting. Because remember, again, you haven't activated insulin. It's mostly fats, right? It's vegetables and fats. Olives have a lot of are high in those healthy fats. So therefore, you're actually just going to go right back into burning your fat. So the whole thing is actually, you don't have to go 0 calories. And that's going to make it easier when you're doing an extended fast or even for a shorter fast, right? But for shorter fasts, of course, I don't, less than 24 hours, I actually just don't bother with that. But for longer fasts, which is what the El Nutra, the 5-day fast, was more focused on, it really does. And I actually feel, everybody's different. So you got to find out for yourself what it is that really helps you. Like the shorter fast, you have to do more frequently. They're easier to do, but the longer fast I do every so often because I wonder whether there's benefits that are unknown, like the autoimmunity, for example, like that I need to get the longer fast in to really get that benefit in. So therefore, I mix in a bunch of longer fasts through the year, and mostly, honestly, like after vacations and stuff, when clearly I haven't watched my diet in a week, sort of thing. And then it's like, okay, I need to get back on track. So that I'll sort of mentally schedule that longer fast so that I'll come back out of it within. So I went on vacation over the holidays, over the Christmas holidays, and I think I was, feeling a little bit overweight and bloated and stuff. But I knew that's what is going to happen. I think a 5-day fast, and by the end of it, it was fine. So I enjoyed my whole week. I didn't stress, I didn't worry, because I knew I could make up for it, right? I wasn't, yes, I was eating all this stuff that wasn't particularly good for me. Like there's a lot of cakes and, stuff that's nobody thinks it's good for you, sugar, right? And but hey, I knew I could make up for it. So I made up for it right away. And then in a week and a bit, it was done, right? So it's like, okay, now I'm back to normal. I'm not spending, you know how New Year's resolutions go. You're spending, you enjoy yourself for a week and then you spend like the next 6 months trying to, get ready for the summer or, get your summer body back, right? I wasn't doing that. It's like a week, it was done. I'm finished, right? So that's the benefits of what's going on. And those are some of the things that can help actually.
Absolutely. And it also kind of reminds me of not just that it's a shorter period of time that has a very strong impact, right? But also that upon completing your longer fasts, there's this sense of motivation that also seems to trigger you to make additional lifestyle changes, especially because for you don't have to make so many other concessions to your nutrition outside of the fast. So it opens up so much space. And in fact, there's this really cool study that was just published this past year showing that there was an increase in physical activity, weekly physical activity in patients with type 2 diabetes doing the fasting mimicking diet by 4 hours a week, whereas those that were just doing regular every single day reduced calorie diets decreased their physical activity by 6 hours a week. And so interesting just to see that one is probably, of course, you've lost weight, you've maintained your muscle, you got this motivation, all of these additional benefits, but also that you've opened up 25 days for the rest of the month where you can think about other things beyond just very carefully planning your calories and foods and everything every single day. So that's one of
Yeah.
my favorite studies too in that vein.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about this whole idea that you should cut 500 calories a day and you're going to lose a pound a week, it's like, honestly, it's got to be the worst advice ever because everybody gets that advice. It doesn't work for anybody. Like the failure rate is honestly like if you look at, real world data, the success of that approach is like, 0.3% or something like that, which means it's got a 99.7% chance of failing, right? It's like the worst advice. Nobody who does it really works. And then you get one guy who said, yeah, I counted my calories. It's like, okay, yeah, that works. It doesn't work for anybody else. So good for you. It works for you. You do it, right? Let's
Yeah.
find something that works for the rest of us. And the thing is that if you're trying to always, if you're obsessing about your calories every single day, just so tiring. Like, isn't it easier just to say, okay, I'm going to do these 5 days, I'm going to set aside to really try and, stay really healthy. I'm going to eat a very low calorie diet, which is what the fasting mimicking diet is. And then the other days, I'm just going to try to be a bit healthy, right? But I'm not going to obsess about calories, right? And but I'll try to eat healthy food. I'll try and eat unprocessed foods. I'll try to cook, not eat junk food, not eat. But that's all. Like everybody knows you're not supposed to eat junk food. You're not supposed to eat chips and ice cream all the time. Like who doesn't know that, right? But if you're trying to obsess about, oh, well, I'm gonna have this piece of salmon, so I'm gonna weigh it, and then I'm gonna count the calories, and then I have to weigh my lettuce and for my salad, and oh, but I put a few sunflower. Like it's an odd way to actually live your life and ultimately unsuccessful because it's just too taxing. Like like who wants to think about it all the time? And yet that's the advice that we give people. It's honestly the worst advice that you could give people. And that's reflected in the fact that people have a lot of trouble losing weight because that's the advice they get. It's like, do this. It's like that's a terrible strategy. It's a terrible, terrible strategy because one, the scientific evidence does not support it. Like, can you find any data, any study anywhere where they said cut 500 calories a day and then had people keep that weight off for 2, 3 years? No, everybody gains that weight back. So there's no data to support that approach. The real world data is even worse, right? So about a 99.7% failure rate, right? Why don't you try something a little bit more, a little bit different? It might work for you. If it doesn't, try something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're coming up at time. I mean, time breeze by on this one. I do want to say, I want to ask one more question from the audience here. But before I do, I just want to remind everybody that at the end of today's session, for anybody that is joining live, there is going to be a very, very special promotion and offer for you guys. It is something very new and exciting. Top secret, in fact, might I add. So please do stick around for that at the end. Now, Dr. Fung, the last question that I wanted to pull for you is from Lori and in fact Donna, and I've actually seen it a bunch of times in the chat here, but the difference between the way males and women and females should fast, and if you feel like they should have any differences in the way they fast.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, fascinating topic. And it's mostly around the menstrual cycle. I mean, that's one of the big differences. And what's really, really interesting is that Megan Ramos, who runs the fasting method, she actually works with a lot of women. So she has always said what you have to do is try to do your fasting in the first half of the cycle. So that's from sort of usually the cycle is counted from the onset of bleeding to ovulation, and that's called the follicular phase. And you want to try to do your fasting within that period of time. And it's because estrogen tends to build up through the follicular phase to ovulation, where you get the spike. And estrogen actually reduces your appetite. So if you look at just women and see how much they eat, there's actually a very noticeable trend. They eat actually less going as they approach that ovulation. So if you're going to be not hungry, then your fasting is just going to be a lot easier. And then once you ovulate, progesterone goes up, and that actually causes a lot of hunger. And again, you can see this on the studies of people not fasting, but just how much they eat, time to time. And the progesterone makes you hungry. You can see that they actually eat more. So they eat less going into ovulation through the follicular phase and up. So you want to take advantage of that. Like, because if you're trying to fast and your progesterone is sky high and you're hungry, well, you're just setting yourself up for failure. Why don't you fast more in the first half of your phase? And what's fascinating is that Megan had noted this, because she worked with thousands of people. So she does coaching and so on, and everybody says that. And so she just noticed this without knowing any of the science and just said, this is what women say. I'm like, oh, that's interesting because that's exactly what the science says too. So if you're thinking about fasting, try to do it in the first half of the cycle. If you're doing a longer fast, like an extended fast, you want to try and get it sort of close to that. Like if you're doing, say, 4 days or 5 days with the fasting mimicking, you want to try and time it as close as you can to sort of the 4 or 5 days before ovulation. So you're probably talking about say day 6 or something like that to 12, yeah, of a 28-day cycle. So you have to decide, right? If you know when your ovulation is, you want to try and time it, because that's when your estrogen is going to be the highest, and that's when your appetite is going to be the lowest, and therefore it's just going to be a lot easier for you. So why do it when it's hard when you can do it when you're easy, right? And then in the luteal phase, which is after ovulation, as you increase your progesterone and hunger tends to go up, that's when you really want to focus on healthy eating. So whole foods, unprocessed foods. Honestly, and has been going longer and longer, the unprocessed food thing I think is just really, really important. But you want to focus on sort of low carbohydrate foods, whole foods, healthy foods, like and really in terms of foods that are healthy, most people agree, like, don't be eating French fries, right? Don't be eating ice cream and candies, right? So just eat healthy whole foods, but maybe the fasting is best done in the first half of the cycle as opposed to the second half of the cycle. It's easier, so therefore you're going to be more successful doing it. So that's the big difference for men and women.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. We have so many questions that I still wish that we could get to, but unfortunately, we do have to let Dr. Fung get back to his practice. So what I'm thinking we need to do is we're going to take all of these questions and we're going to have to get you back on, and we're going to just focus on all of these incredible audience questions that are here. And also, we are so grateful to work with Dr. Fung in a larger capacity, and we are hopeful that we'll do more blogs and more really great content where we answer more of these questions. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Funk, for being here today and for answering some questions. And I think you'll be back.
Thank you so much.